Thank you, comrades and friends. Before I begin, I would like to say that I share completely your concern about Najib missing from this campus for so many days, an unprecedented occurrence on this campus. I also stand with you in your struggle to bring him back to the campus. I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to pay my respects to Comrade Fidel Castro. I think the life of Comrade Fidel Castro, as indeed the saga of the Cuban Revolution, in a sense is really an incredible saga. It's like a fairy tale. So many odds were stacked against the Cuban Revolution that any of these odds would have been quite enough to defeat any other revolution. The Cuban Revolution withstood all of them and continues to this day. Just imagine one after another the events and the episodes of the Cuban Revolution. You have a group of young people who rise against a dictator Batista and they attack the Moncada barracks. Most of them get killed. The leader of that group is arrested and sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. You would have thought that, okay, there the uprising would have ended. But Batista, like completely, supremely self-confident dictators, in fact, in a year's time, releases Comrade Fidel. And then you would have thought that Comrade Fidel, having been released from 15 years of imprisonment, would disappear somewhere and maybe stop participating in revolutionary politics. But within a year, he comes back, along with another group of people, in a ship called Ranma, back to the island to fight a war against Batista. Most of the people who come on that ship, they actually are killed, and barely a dozen or so survive. You would have thought that the matter would have ended there. But on the other hand, those who survive then carry on a guerrilla struggle that actually overthrows Batista. Then you find the International Monetary Fund getting into the act and telling Comrade Fidel Castro, please pursue the same policies which were being pursued before as a part of the conditionality for the loans that we are going to give you, because the economy needed loans. At that point, any other government again might have caved in, but not so the Cuban government. They actually make a decisive break with the IMF, in fact with the capitalist system as a whole, and of course, aided by the Soviet Union, they chart a completely new course. Within a very short time, they are actually invaded by the United States, and you would have thought that that would have actually finished the revolution, but no, they actually defeat the invaders. Then you have decades and decades of sanctions against Cuba, blockade of Cuba, but the revolution survives. Not only does it survive, but it actually institutes, as was said earlier, one of the most amazing program of substantive human rights. Philosophers draw a distinction between legal and political rights on the one hand and substantive rights, right to education, right to health, right to employment, right to food, and so on the other hand. And Cuba, of course, has an achievement in terms of substantive human rights, which certainly no other country in the third world has, and which the United States, the richest of the capitalist countries, does not have. Now that's the revolution. But I would like to talk to you not even about these things, but I'd like to talk to you about something else, which is much less known about the Cuban Revolution, and which we in India certainly know very little about, and which itself has come into the open only very recently through a book which was written by an American historian. And that's Cuba's role in the liberation of Southern Africa. Its role in actually ending the apartheid regime in South Africa. Now, you would know that the South African apartheid government actually had a plan of surrounding itself by a group of countries, all of whom would actually be their puppets or completely dependent upon them. As a result, they actually ruled over Namibia, And when Portugal threw off the Salazarist dictatorship, then you had the possibility of power being handed to the people, to the liberation fighters in Angola. In Angola, the main liberation fighters force was MPLA, which was led by Comrade Agostinho Neto, and of course it was clear that on November 11th, 1975, Angola is going to become free and Agostinho Neto would actually come to power. There were two other small guerrilla groups who were supported by, or two other small fighter groups were supported, one of them by South Africa, the other by the United States. The group supported by South Africa was led by Jonas Savimbi, and South Africa wanted to put Savimbi in power instead of the MPLA so that they would actually have a puppet government in independent Angola. When Savimbi's troops could not make much of an advance vis-à-vis MPLA, South Africa decided to invade Angola, and this was in October of 1975. Remember, the Portuguese government had announced, the democratic Portuguese government had announced that on November 11th they're going to hand over power to the Angolan people. So in October, South Africa invades Angola. And of course they march into Angola and were about to decimate the MPLA. At which point, Agostinho Neto made an appeal to Cuba and to Comrade Fidel Castro, and Castro sent in between November 1975 and April 1976, 36,000 Cuban troops. Those troops not only beat back the South Africans, but what is more, the South Africans then, they went into Namibia, they beat back the South Africans, pushed them back into Namibia, which was then under South African control, and it was in 1988 that actually a treaty was signed whereby Namibia became independent and South African troops went back to South Africa, and MPLA remained in control as far as Angola was concerned. This was such a remarkable achievement, and of course within a few months of this happening, the apartheid regime fell in South Africa. This was so remarkable. It was remarkable because, as Nelson Mandela said, that it destroyed the myth of white invincibility. Remember, Cuba is a multiracial country, so the Cuban troops were not white troops. On the contrary, most of them were actually black or colored and so on. And the fact that they defeated the South African troops, which are all white, is something which actually acted as an enormous fillip to the liberation struggle all over Africa. And this is something which Nelson Mandela talked about. And of course, Angola was the place where training was imparted not only to the ANC, but to the entire set of freedom fighters in southern Africa. Cuba was a country which was at that time facing sanctions, it was blockaded, it had an economy which was in a terrible state, naturally because of all these constraints, but nonetheless, the Cubans sent in troops and bore the brunt of this kind of struggle against the South African apartheid regime, and were responsible to a very significant extent in the pushing back and the defeat of apartheid in southern Africa. Karl Marx had once said that a nation which oppresses another cannot be free. In fact, I would like to turn it around to say that a nation is free above all when it sheds blood for the freedom from oppression of another nation. And that's what the Cubans did. For a very long time, it used to be said by the Americans that actually it was the Soviet Union which was fighting the war and the Cubans were paid to act as mercenaries. Now, I mentioned to you the American historian whose book came out in 2013. He actually went through thousands of papers in order to show that, as a matter of fact, it was the Cubans who were pushing the Russians, because Brezhnev was not very keen to intervene, but it was at the Cuban initiative that this entire struggle was carried on. Fidel once even said that, look, it's not very easy for us to continue with the struggle, but I give you my word that until the MPLA is assured of power, free from all threats, our troops are going to remain in Angola. The person who spread this lie that basically the Cubans were acting at the behest of the Soviet Union, were mercenaries as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, was of course a despicable character called Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, however, you know, even despicable characters occasionally speak the truth. Henry Kissinger, in his autobiography, says that I made a mistake. Actually, the Cubans were not acting at the behest of the Soviet Union. The only reason I can provide for the Cuban presence in Southern Africa is that probably, he says, Fidel Castro was the only revolutionary leader in the world at that time. Fidel Castro remained the only revolutionary leader in the world until long after Southern Africa had been liberated. He remained a symbol of hope for everybody. His courage sustained everybody. He was almost like a member of your family. Whenever you felt depressed, you looked at Fidel, and then that actually cheered you up. Fidel Castro was the most outstanding revolutionary leader in the last quarter, certainly, of the 20th century, and his passing is a very big blow to the revolutionary movement, even though, of course, he was aged, he was retired, but nonetheless, it was a kind of moral force for everyone amongst us. I had the privilege of meeting Castro once in Havana. There used to be an outfit called the Association of Third World Economists, which I think had a conference in Havana in the mid-80s. Castro not only came and spoke at our plenary session, but invited all of us for dinner in an enormous, beautiful palace and so on. And that was actually around the time of May Day. And a remarkably high proportion of the entire Cuban population was actually marching through the streets of Havana on May Day, people carrying children on their shoulders, families and so on. I still have vivid memories of it. But as I said, freedom above all consists in a nation shedding blood for the freedom of another. And Cuban Revolution showed that. Thank you very much.